Did you know that there are two types of contrast in this color grading world? Most people don't know the difference between the two, and I would argue it is one of the factors why projects can often look amateurish and inconsistent. Now, to see the difference between the two types of contrast, it's probably easier to hop into DaVinci Resolve and show you there. So the first type of contrast is what most people think of when we talk about contrast, and that would be considered S-curve contrast. So right here you see I have a little grayscale ramp from black to white. If I grab the contrast tool here and just bump it up a little bit, you will see that both in the waveform and on the gradient, we're making the darker parts darker and the brighter parts brighter, and it forms this S shape. Thus why we call it an S-curve contrast. Now what's great about S-curve contrast is although we are increasing the contrast, you'll notice that the whitest part and the darkest part don't actually go anywhere. So we're not clipping any values, which is really nice. So let's try this out on an image here. You'll see we got the image making up the left side, and on the right I've just included some steps. You'll see that the steps are on the waveform here. So if we increase our S-curve contrast, what do you see? You see an expansion of the middle, right? Our darker parts are getting darker, our brighter parts are getting brighter. I'm just going to adjust the pivot slightly so the image is a little bit on the brighter side. But there we go. We are adding contrast to the image, and we're not clipping anything, right? The center of this light, it's still looking good. And if you look at the bottom here, you'll notice that we're not actually losing detail. But there's an issue here. Did you notice as we increase contrast in the core of the image, we actually we flatten out some contrast in the highest and the lowest parts of the image. We can see this happening in our test clip over here. If you see this, if you see these steps on the side, you can see that as we add S-curve contrast, we're increasing that contrast in the middle core of the image, but towards the edges, towards the brighter and the lower edges, we're actually losing contrast. Here, let me really crank some of this contrast up here. Even though we technically don't lose information, let me zoom in here on her hair. Although we're not clipping black, we really do lose a lot of the detail right here in the image. So we can see some of kind of the individual texture of her hair, but with lots of S-curve contrast, we're not clipping, but it gives the impression of us clipping. A technical term that you'll hear a lot when it comes to S-curve contrast is non-uniform expansion. Meaning, as we expand the contrast of the image, it's not happening equally across all parts of it. This means that we're actually tweaking some of the tonality of the image. In other words, the more S-curve we add, the different feel or aesthetic we are adding to the piece as well. Now this becomes a problem if you're trying to match shots in a scene with different types of S-curve contrast, because different levels of the S-curve will have different aesthetic and tonal looks. So there has to be a solution for this problem, right? And that comes in the form of linear contrast. Let's jump back to this ramp and let me reset the contrast. So if an S-curve creates an S shape, linear contrast would be taking the brightest parts of the image and just making it brighter, and the darkest parts and making it darker in a continuous line that is equally applied to the entire image. Now, there's a number of different ways you can do this. In Resolve, gain and lift both work with linear contrast. So if you have a control panel, you can just tweak the gain up and tweak the lift down, and you've got that. Alternatively, you can just kick the gain up if you want and use offset as that pivot point. So we would call this a uniform expansion of the contrast because it's affecting all parts of the image equally. Let's look at what this does to our example clip. So I'm going to start by bringing the shadows down until they're right about at 0, and then I'm just going to bring the highlights up and balance for right around the face there. Now let me zoom in. Do you notice how when we're looking at her hair, we still maintain all of that original texture in there? Let me kind of disable this. Do you see? We still have all the texture there. We didn't get rid of any of it because we're not decreasing, we're not losing and flattening out contrast on the bottom part of the image. That doesn't mean this is always the right choice, but if we're looking to hold true to the aesthetic and the tonality that existed in the original footage, this is a great way to go. Now, there is a downside to this, and that is we clip our highlights. So later in this clip, you see this little lamp here. In the original footage, you know that lamp actually has detail, but expanding the contrast in this linear fashion clips it right out. So the question is, which is the correct form of contrast to use in your pieces? And here's the great answer. Both. These should be used in conjunction with each other. For example, let's look at this image. Let's say that we like where the linear contrast ends up, but we really want a nice highlight roll off. Well, why can't we combine the two? Let's go over to our ramp. Right now we have a linear contrast applied, but what if we wanted to roll off the top? Well, Resolve has a nice little tool called High Soft, where we can just roll off the top of the image. Do you see what that's doing right there? It's rolling off the top. Now let's hop back to our clip and see what that lamp looks like. Hey, would you look at that? You've got a really nice highlight roll-off. So it goes from here, super clipped, to a highlight roll-off. And this is what our curve looks like. Mostly linear with a nice little roll-off of the highlights. Most of the time on projects when we're using S-curves, those S-curves go really late in the node tree of a project. The reason being is we often don't want to be messing a lot with the S-curve of a scene or a project. Usually what we'll do is we'll have an S-curve or roll-off which is consistent for either the entire scene or the entire project. So let's add a little bit of S-curve right here and then increase the roll-off a bit more. But then, on a shot-by-shot or scene-by-scene basis, we'll be using linear contrast to match the look. So we've already established here a bit of our S-curve, and before that is when we will apply our linear transform. So let's see here. We'll balance out the shot here. So here's my encouragement to you. When you're thinking about the project as a whole, start from the place of asking, what do we want aesthetically the contrast to feel like? And most of the time you're talking about that S-curve and the highlight and shadow roll-off. But then from there, as you're looking at expanding each scene or shot, don't be messing with that S-curve contrast, because then you're gonna be adjusting tonally every shot or every scene in a way that it will feel subtly inconsistent, in a way that it's hard to place your finger on it. If you want to learn more about contrast and pivot and some of the technicality behind those tools, Avery Peck released a great video diving really deep into how those work. Also, if you want to play with this shot that I was working on today, this is just free sample footage that Ari has online. Take a look at the resource link in the description of the video and it will show you where you can download it and play with it as well. If you like this content and you want to stay up to date on it, I would encourage you to hit the subscribe button. And if you like the video, if you wouldn't mind hitting a like, it actually helps the video reach more people. You know how this YouTube thing works. In addition, I would love to know what you thought of this distinction between S-curve and linear contrast in the comments. So let me know your thoughts there. Well, if you've made it this far in the video, you truly are a color nerd and one of my people. I will catch you in the next one.